My name is Dante Rivera, and I'm a pharmacist who survived the first 6 weeks of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged America into a frozen wasteland, I had to choose between my medical oath and keeping my group alive. I watched Phoenix die around me, made impossible decisions about who lived and who died, and discovered that in the apocalypse, medicine isn't just about healing, it's about power. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dante Rivera, and what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about survival forever. 6 weeks ago, I was just a clinical pharmacist working the morning shift at Phoenix General Hospital. I had a routine that kept me grounded in a world that always seemed on the edge of chaos. Every morning at 5:30, I'd arrive at the hospital, check the overnight medication orders, and begin preparing the complex 4 drips that kept our critical patients alive. I took pride in my precision, measuring exact dosages down to the milligram, because I knew that one mistake could mean the difference between life and death. What I didn't realize was that I'd been tracking an unusual pattern in our emergency medication requests for weeks leading up to that Tuesday morning. More insulin orders than usual, increased heart medications, a surge in anxiety prescriptions that seemed to spike every time the news mentioned seismic activity. The stress was killing people before they even knew what was coming. I'd noted it in my daily reports, but like everyone else, I assumed it was just another temporary uptick in Phoenix's always stressed population. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I was restocking the insulin in our main refrigeration unit when I noticed we were going through our supplies faster than normal. Mrs. Rodriguez, a diabetic patient in room 312, had been asking for extra doses because her blood sugar kept spiking from anxiety. Mr. Thompson in the cardiac unit needed his nitroglycerin refilled twice in 1 week. These weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of something much larger that none of us could see coming. I was preparing a morphine drip for a post-surgical patient when I heard Dr. Sarah Chun arguing with the hospital administrator about emergency preparedness. She'd been pushing for weeks to increase our stockpiles of essential medications, citing reports about supply chain disruptions and increasing natural disasters. The administrator kept dismissing her concerns, saying they couldn't afford to tie up that much capital in inventory that might expire unused. I wish I'd listened more carefully to that conversation, because Dr. Chun had a way of seeing patterns that the rest of us missed. The thing about working in a hospital pharmacy is that you develop an almost supernatural awareness of patterns. You start to notice when certain medications are being requested more frequently, when doctors are ordering unusual combinations of drugs, when the rhythm of medical care starts to shift in ways that most people wouldn't pick up on in the weeks before the eruption. I'd been seeing requests for medications that suggested people were preparing for something, even if they didn't consciously know what that something was. I'd grabbed not just the obvious emergency supplies that morning, but also the psychiatric medications that I had a feeling people would need more than ever. Lorazepam for anxiety, sertraline for depression, even some of the newer antipsychotic medications that we used for patients experiencing severe trauma responses. Something deep in my gut told me that when society started to break down, the mental health crisis would be just as deadly as any physical injuries we'd face. At 6:47 a.m. on October 15, 2024, everything changed. The ground beneath the hospital started shaking, not with the gentle rolling motion of the minor earthquakes we occasionally experienced in Phoenix, but with a violent, persistent tremor that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. I was checking the stability of our medication refrigeration units when every emergency alert system in the building started screaming simultaneously. The automated voice cut through the hospital's normal morning routine like a knife through silk. Yellowstone supervolcano has erupted. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. I'd heard those words before during emergency preparedness drills, but hearing them spoken with genuine urgency created a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The magnitude of what that announcement meant hit me before it registered. With most of the staff around me, within minutes, the hospital transformed from a place of healing into a fortress of panic. Patients who could walk were trying to leave, while those who couldn't were crying out for their families. The nursing staff was torn between maintaining their professional duties and their instincts to protect their own loved ones. I watched Dr. Martinez abandon his rounds to call his wife, while Nurse Johnson tried to calm a room full of cardiac patients whose heart monitors were all showing dangerous spikes. The pharmacy became a refuge for those who understood that medications would be the most valuable currency in whatever came next. I wasn't the only one who realized this. Dr. Chun appeared at my station within 15 minutes of the announcement, her face pale but determined. She helped me begin the process of securing our most critical supplies, working with the kind of focused intensity that told me she'd been preparing for this possibility far longer than the rest of us. As we worked, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of following the evacuation protocols that called for staff to leave the building, I chose to stay and protect the pharmacy. I knew that whatever was coming, people would need these medications to survive, and I was one of the few people in the building who understood how to properly store, prepare, and distribute them safely. The first sign that this wasn't a temporary emergency came when the power grid started fluctuating. Our backup generators kicked in automatically, but I could see the fuel gauge indicators showing consumption rates that were far higher than normal. The hospital's heating system was working overtime to maintain temperature, as something outside was causing the ambient air to cool rapidly. I started calculating in my head how long our emergency power would last under these conditions. By noon, on that first day, the sky outside had turned a color I'd never seen before. It wasn't the blue-black of a thunderstorm or the orange-red of a sunset, but something that looked like dried blood mixed with ash. The temperature outside had dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours, and it was still falling. The hospital's windows were starting to fog up from the temperature differential between inside and outside. That's when I saw them through the pharmacy window. Groups of people moving through the hospital parking lot, not with the panicked randomness of evacuation, but with the organized purposefulness of people who had a plan. They were carrying bags, weapons, and most importantly, they were moving together as coordinated units. These weren't just families fleeing the disaster, they were groups that had formed quickly and were already thinking strategically about survival. I started keeping detailed notes about everyone's medical conditions in a small notebook I'd grabbed from the supply closet. Call it professional habit, but I had a feeling I'd need to remember exactly who needed what medications to stay alive. Mrs. Patterson needed insulin every 12 hours or she'd go into diabetic shock. Mr. Williams required blood thinners to prevent his artificial heart valve from clotting. Little Amy Chun, Dr. Chun's daughter, who had been brought to the hospital when the schools closed, needed her asthma inhaler every 4 hours. The list grew longer as more people sought shelter in the hospital. Each name represented not just a person, but a complex web of medical dependencies that I was increasingly responsible for managing. I realized that my role was evolving from pharmacist to something closer to a medical logistics coordinator for a growing community of survivors. 3 days after the initial eruption, the ash clouds reached Phoenix. I watched through the pharmacy window as the sky turned completely dark at what should have been noon. The ash fell like snow, but instead of the clean white precipitation I remembered from childhood trips to Flagstaff, this was gray-black powder that seemed to stick to everything it touched. Within hours, the hospital's air filtration system was struggling to keep the particles out of our supposedly sealed building. The temperature continued to drop. By the end of that third day, it was snowing in Phoenix. Actual snow, in October, in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. I watched the saguaro cacti in the hospital's courtyard garden slowly turn black as the cold killed them from the inside out. These plants had survived in the desert for over a century, and they were dying in a matter of hours. The hospital's patient population was changing rapidly. The people who had been able to leave were gone, evacuated by family members or discharged to make room for the growing number of cold-related injuries. Those who remained were either too sick to move or, like me, had chosen to stay because we understood that the hospital represented the best chance for survival in whatever was coming. I met Janet Morrison on the fourth day. She was a trauma nurse who had worked at Phoenix General for 15 years, and she'd made the same decision I had about staying to help rather than fleeing. Janet had a practical understanding of emergency medicine that complemented my pharmaceutical knowledge perfectly. She could assess injuries and determine treatment priorities, while I could provide the exact medications needed and ensure they were properly dosed. Janet brought with her a maintenance worker named Marcus Webb, who had been essential in keeping the hospital systems running as the outside world began to collapse. Marcus understood the building's heating, electrical, and water systems better than anyone, and he'd been working around the clock to modify our infrastructure for long-term survival rather than short-term patient care. The three of us formed the core of what would become our survival group. We understood that our individual skills were more valuable when combined, and we began planning for the possibility that we might need to defend the hospital against people who wanted to take our supplies by force. Marcus had already identified the most defensible areas of the building and had been quietly reinforcing doors and windows. By the fifth day, the power grid failures had become widespread. Our backup generators were running constantly, and I was calculating fuel consumption rates that showed we had maybe 2 weeks of power remaining if we maintained current usage levels. The hospital's heating system was struggling to keep our occupied areas warm as the outside temperature continued to drop. I made my first major decision as a leader during a meeting in the hospital cafeteria on that fifth day. We had gathered 17 survivors, a mix of medical staff, patients who couldn't leave, and a few family members who had come to the hospital seeking shelter. The question we faced was whether to try to conserve resources for a longer period or to use them more liberally with the hope that outside help would arrive soon. I chose conservation. I established medication rationing protocols that would extend our critical supplies for months rather than weeks. This meant that some people would receive less than optimal dosages, and some non-essential medications would be discontinued entirely. It was the first time I had to make decisions that I knew would directly impact people's quality of life and possibly their survival. The rationing decision revealed something about leadership that I hadn't understood before. When you're responsible for keeping people alive with limited resources, every choice becomes a moral judgment about who deserves what level of care. I had to decide whether the elderly patient with chronic pain deserved the same amount of morphine as the young mother with a post-surgical infection. These weren't medical decisions. They were ethical ones that would define what kind of person I was becoming. Dr. Chun had been monitoring radio communications from other hospitals and emergency services, and the news was worse than we'd feared. The ash clouds were spreading globally, and the temperature drop wasn't limited to our region. This wasn't a local disaster that would be resolved in days or weeks. It was a fundamental change in the planet's climate that could last for years. On the fifth night, I was doing my final medication inventory when I heard voices outside the pharmacy. Not the voices of our survivor group, but unfamiliar voices speaking in the low, urgent tones of people who were planning something. I moved to the window and saw them clearly for the first time. A group of 8 people, all armed, moving through the hospital corridors with the confidence of people who had been watching us and learning our routines. They weren't patients or medical staff. They were outsiders who had identified the hospital as a valuable target and were conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance. I watched them examine our security measures, test our door locks, and discuss what they observed in hushed conversations that I couldn't quite hear through the glass. That's when I realized we weren't just survivors anymore. We were targets. The medications I'd been so careful to preserve weren't just medical supplies. They were treasure in a world where traditional currency had become meaningless. People would kill for antibiotics, for insulin, for pain medication that could mean the difference between life and death. I gathered Janet and Marcus immediately and told them what I'd seen. We spent the rest of that night developing security protocols and identifying defensive positions within the hospital. Marcus showed us how to use medical equipment as barriers, while Janet explained how to treat gunshot wounds and other traumatic injuries that we might soon be dealing with. The next morning, they came back. Not just the 8 I'd seen the night before, but a larger group that included women and children. They approached the main entrance openly, without weapons visible, and asked to speak with whoever was in charge. I knew this was a test, a way to assess our capabilities and determine whether we could be taken by force or if negotiation would be necessary. I made the decision to meet with them, against the advice of Janet and Marcus, who wanted to refuse all contact. I believed that understanding what they wanted and what they were capable of would be essential information for our survival. I also knew that my medical knowledge gave me leverage that might be valuable in negotiations. Their leader introduced himself as Ray Collins, a former construction foreman who had gathered his family and neighbors when the emergency began. He was polite and reasonable, explaining that they were looking for medical supplies for members of their group who had been injured during the chaos of the first few days. He particularly needed antibiotics for a child with a severe infection and insulin for an elderly diabetic man. What concerned me wasn't what Ray said, but what I observed about his physical condition. He had a cough that he was trying to suppress. The kind of wet, persistent cough that I'd heard too many times in the hospital's respiratory unit. His skin had a slight grayish tinge that suggested poor circulation, and he was breathing more heavily than the conversation required. Ray Collins was sick, possibly seriously sick, and he was trying to hide it from both his own people and from us. I agreed to provide some of the medications he requested, but not all of them. I gave him enough antibiotics to treat the child's infection, but I held back the majority of our supply. I provided a week's worth of insulin for the diabetic man, but explained that we couldn't spare more without knowing how long our own supplies would need to last. Ray accepted this arrangement, but I could see in his eyes that he was calculating our resources and our defenses. This wasn't just a medical transaction, it was intelligence gathering. He was learning how much we had, how willing we were to share, and how capable we were of defending ourselves if sharing became involuntary. After they left, I made a decision that would define our survival strategy. I began preparing for the possibility that we would need to defend the hospital against people who wanted to take our supplies by force. This meant not just physical preparations, but psychological ones as well. I had to accept that my role was evolving from healer to protector, and that protecting some people might require harming others. The medication I'd given to Ray's group was part of a larger strategy. I'd kept careful notes about the symptoms I'd observed in their leader, and I had a strong suspicion that his condition would worsen over the following days. A wet cough in. These conditions, combined with the physical stress of leadership and the poor nutrition that was becoming common, suggested pneumonia or another serious respiratory infection. I calculated that Ray would need more advanced medical treatment within a week, possibly sooner. When he returned, and I was certain he would return, I would be in a position to negotiate from strength, because I would have something he needed more than he needed our general medical supplies. I would have the specific medications required to save his life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the ethical implications of what I was planning. I was preparing to use a man's illness as leverage in negotiations that might determine whether our group lived or died. 6 weeks ago, I would have been horrified by such calculations. Now, I was beginning to understand that survival required a different kind of moral framework than the one I'd operated under in the normal world. I started keeping a detailed journal of not just medical conditions, but of the psychological changes I was observing in our group and in myself. The people who had been patients were becoming fighters. The medical staff were becoming strategists. The maintenance worker was becoming a security expert. We were all evolving into versions of ourselves that would have been unrecognizable just days earlier. The temperature outside continued to drop. By the end of the 5th day, it was -10 degrees Fahrenheit in Phoenix, a temperature that the desert city had never experienced in recorded history. The hospital's heating system was consuming fuel at an alarming rate, and Marcus estimated that we had less than 10 days of power remaining if we maintained current usage. I realized that our real enemy wasn't the cold, or the ash, or even the armed groups that were beginning to form throughout the frozen city. Our real enemy was time. Every day that passed brought us closer to the moment when our resources would be exhausted and we would be forced to make choices that would determine who lived and who died. And that's when I realized the real apocalypse wasn't the volcanic winter. It was what we do to each other to survive it. The groups moving through the frozen city weren't just scavenging for supplies, they were preparing for war. And whether we wanted to or not, we were about to become combatants in a conflict where the stakes were nothing less than the future of human civilization. The armed group returned on the 6th day, just as I had predicted they would. This time, Ray Collins wasn't trying to hide his deteriorating condition. His cough had worsened significantly, and I could hear the wet, labored breathing that confirmed my suspicions about pneumonia. When he approached the main entrance, he was flanked by more people than before, and their demeanor had shifted from polite negotiation to barely contained desperation. I met them in the hospital's main lobby, with Janet and Marcus positioned strategically behind me. Ray's first words confirmed what I already knew. "We need more antibiotics," he said, his voice hoarse and strained. "The child is better, but now several of our adults are getting sick." He didn't mention his own condition, but I could see him fighting to suppress coughing fits that were clearly painful. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I had something Ray needed desperately, but I also needed to establish that we weren't a charity organization that could be pressured into giving away our survival resources. I told him I could provide limited antibiotics, but only in exchange for information about what his group had observed in the city, and a commitment that they would help defend the hospital if other groups tried to take it by force. Ray agreed to the terms, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing whether it would be easier to negotiate with us or to simply take what he needed. The fact that he chose negotiation told me that his group wasn't strong enough to assault the hospital directly, at least not yet. But I also noticed that he was taking careful note of our defensive positions and the number of people we had. The information Ray provided was more disturbing than I'd expected. The city was fragmenting rapidly into territorial zones controlled by different groups. Some were families and neighbors who had banded together for protection, like Ray's group. Others were more organized and aggressive, taking supplies by force from anyone who couldn't defend themselves. The police and National Guard had largely abandoned their posts to protect their own families, leaving most of the city in a state of lawlessness. Most concerning was his report about the medical district. The other hospitals in Phoenix had been overrun by groups seeking medications and medical equipment. Phoenix Children's Hospital had been completely emptied, and St. Joseph's had been burned down during a conflict between rival groups. We were one of the last functioning medical facilities in the city, which made us both incredibly valuable and incredibly vulnerable. After Ray's group left, I called a meeting with our core survivors. I explained that we needed to prepare for the possibility that larger, more organized groups would target us in the coming days. Our medical supplies weren't just valuable, They were irreplaceable, and there were people in the city who would kill for access to them. Janet had been thinking along similar lines. She'd been observing the patterns of people approaching the hospital, and had noticed that we were being watched almost constantly. Different individuals would position themselves at various points around the building, observing our routines and counting our numbers. This wasn't casual interest, it was systematic surveillance. Marcus had been working on defensive modifications to the building. He'd identified the pharmacy, the main medication storage area, and the central nursing station as the most critical areas to defend. He'd also been reinforcing doors and windows, creating barriers that would force any attackers to approach through predictable routes where we could concentrate our limited defensive capabilities. I made the decision to implement strict rationing protocols that would extend our supplies for months rather than weeks. This meant reducing everyone's medications to the absolute minimum levels required for survival. Mrs. Patterson would receive just enough insulin to prevent diabetic shock, but not enough to maintain optimal blood sugar levels. Mr. Williams would get blood thinners to prevent his artificial heart valve from clotting, but at doses that would leave him constantly at risk. The rationing decision revealed something about leadership that I hadn't understood before. When you're responsible for keeping people alive with limited resources, every choice becomes a moral judgment about who deserves what level of care. I had to decide whether the elderly patient with chronic pain deserved the same amount of morphine as the young mother with a post-surgical infection. These weren't medical decisions. They were ethical ones that would define what kind of person I was becoming. On the 7th day, a new person arrived at the hospital. Maria Santos was a registered nurse who had been working at a clinic in South Phoenix. When the eruption occurred, she'd made her way to our hospital after her clinic had been looted and abandoned. Maria was skilled, experienced, and desperately needed given our growing population of survivors. Maria integrated into our group quickly, perhaps too quickly. She was eager to help with medication management and asked detailed questions about our supply levels and storage locations. She volunteered for extra shifts and made herself indispensable in ways that initially seemed like a blessing. However, I noticed that she was particularly interested in our security protocols and our plans for defending the hospital. I wanted to trust Maria completely, but something about her behavior raised subtle concerns. She asked questions about our radio communications and seemed very interested in knowing when we conducted our security rounds. When I showed her our medication inventory, she spent more time studying the quantities and locations than seemed necessary for someone just trying to help with patient care. Despite my concerns, Maria's medical expertise was invaluable. She was skilled at treating cold-related injuries, and her experience with trauma care was essential as we began seeing more victims of violence from the city. She also spoke fluent Spanish, which helped us communicate with several Hispanic families who had sought shelter in the hospital. The insulin crisis began on the 8th day. We had 3 diabetic patients who required regular injections to survive, but our insulin supplies were running lower than I'd anticipated. The cold was affecting the medication's potency, and the stress of the situation was causing blood sugar spikes that required higher doses than normal. I faced an impossible choice. We had enough insulin to keep 2 patients alive for several weeks, or to keep all 3 alive for about 10 days. After that, at least one person would die from diabetic shock while the others watched. I spent hours calculating different rationing scenarios, trying to find a solution that would keep everyone alive, but the mathematics were unforgiving. The group meeting where I explained the insulin situation was the most difficult conversation I'd ever had. Mrs. Patterson, who had been diabetic for 30 years, volunteered to reduce her doses so that the other 2 patients could survive longer. Mr. Chun, Dr. Chun's elderly father, argued that he should be the one to sacrifice since he was the oldest. The 3rd patient, a teenager named Jessica, couldn't even participate in the conversation because her parents were too emotional to discuss the possibility of losing their daughter. I implemented a rotation system where each patient would receive reduced doses, extending everyone's survival time while I searched for additional insulin supplies in the city. This wasn't a real solution, just a delay that would give us more time to find other options. But it was the only ethical choice I could make, given the resources available. The psychological impact of managing the insulin crisis was overwhelming. I was essentially deciding who would live and who would die based on mathematical calculations about medication availability. Every injection I administered was a reminder that I was playing God with people's lives, and that my decisions would determine which families would be torn apart by loss. On the 9th day, we conducted our first supply run into the frozen city. Marcus had identified several pharmacies within a few miles of the hospital that might still have insulin and other critical medications. Janet, Marcus, and I ventured out together, leaving Maria in charge of the hospital's medical operations. The city was unrecognizable. Phoenix had transformed from a desert metropolis into something that looked like a frozen wasteland from another planet. The saguaro cacti stood like black monuments to the world that had existed just over a week ago. Cars were buried under ash and snow, and many buildings had collapsed under the weight of accumulating precipitation that the desert infrastructure had never been designed to handle. We found insulin at the third pharmacy we searched, but we also found evidence that we weren't the only ones seeking medical supplies. The pharmacy had been systematically looted, with whoever had been there before us taking specific medications and leaving others behind. This suggested that other groups had medical expertise similar to ours and were competing for the same resources. The supply run was successful, but it also revealed how dangerous the city had become. We encountered other groups of survivors, some friendly but most suspicious and potentially hostile. The normal social contracts that had governed interactions between strangers had completely broken down. Everyone was armed, everyone was desperate, and everyone was willing to fight for resources that could mean the difference between life and death. When we returned to the hospital, I discovered that Maria had been asking the other survivors detailed questions about our supply run. She wanted to know which pharmacies we'd visited, what we'd found, and what our plans were for future expeditions. Her interest seemed professional and helpful, but I noticed that she was taking notes about information that didn't seem directly related to patient care. The first major attack on the hospital came on the 10th day. It wasn't Ray's group, but a larger, more organized group that had been operating in the medical district. They approached the hospital at dawn, when they expected us to be least prepared, and demanded access to our medication supplies. Their leader was a man named David Park who claimed to be a former military medic. He had 15 people with him, all armed, and he spoke with the authority of someone who had been planning this operation for days. David explained that his group had injured members who needed immediate medical attention, and that they were prepared to take what they needed by force if we weren't willing to negotiate. I met with David in the hospital lobby, with Janet and Marcus positioned behind me and other survivors stationed at strategic points throughout the building. The conversation was tense but professional, with both sides understanding that we were negotiating to avoid violence that would likely result in casualties on both sides. David's group needed antibiotics for infected wounds, pain medication for severe injuries, and surgical supplies for emergency procedures. These were reasonable requests that I could have fulfilled under normal circumstances, but I also knew that giving them what they wanted would severely compromise our ability to care for our own people. I agreed to provide some of the medications they requested, but not all of them. I gave them enough antibiotics to treat their most serious infections, but I held back the majority of our supply. I provided limited pain medication, but explained that we couldn't spare more without endangering our own patients. David accepted this arrangement, but I could see that he was assessing our defenses and our capabilities. He was noting the number of people we had, the types of weapons we possessed, and the layout of the building. This wasn't just a medical negotiation, it was reconnaissance for a possible future attack. After David's group left, I realized that our defensive preparations were inadequate. We had been thinking about defending against small groups like Ray's, but we were now facing organized military-style operations that could overwhelm our limited capabilities. I called an emergency meeting to discuss upgrading our security measures. Marcus had been working on more sophisticated defensive modifications. He'd identified choke points where we could force attackers to approach through narrow corridors. That would limit their numerical advantage. He'd also been working on early warning systems that would give us advance notice of approaching groups. Janet had been training some of our survivors in basic combat medical techniques. She was teaching people how to treat gunshot wounds, how to stop severe bleeding, and how to perform emergency surgical procedures with limited equipment. These skills were becoming essential as the violence in the city escalated. I made the decision to establish a more formal command structure within our group. We needed clear chains of authority for different types of emergencies, and we needed people who could make quick decisions without having to consult with everyone else. I took overall leadership responsibility, with Janet in charge of medical operations and Marcus responsible for security and building maintenance. The new command structure wasn't popular with everyone in our group. Some people felt that we were becoming too militaristic, that we were losing the cooperative spirit that had helped us survive the first week. Others argued that we needed even more strict discipline and that democratic decision-making was too slow for the kinds of threats we were facing. On the 11th day, Dr. Chun picked up radio communications that changed everything. She'd been monitoring emergency frequencies and had intercepted messages between different survivor groups throughout the city. The communications revealed that the groups weren't just competing for resources. They were actively planning coordinated attacks on the remaining hospitals and medical facilities. The radio chatter indicated that there was a network of groups sharing information about which locations had the most valuable supplies and which ones were most vulnerable to attack. Our hospital was mentioned specifically as a high priority target because of our pharmaceutical resources and our relatively small defensive force. More disturbing was the revelation that some of these groups had inside information about our operations. They knew details about our daily routines, our security protocols, and our supply levels that they couldn't have obtained through external observation alone. Someone in our group was providing information to potential attackers. I began watching our survivors more carefully, looking for signs of suspicious behavior or unauthorized communications. The person feeding information to the outside groups had to be someone with access to our planning meetings and our supply inventories. This narrowed the list of suspects to our core leadership group and a few other trusted individuals. Maria's behavior became increasingly concerning. She volunteered for communications duties that would give her access to our radio equipment, and she asked detailed questions about our defensive plans that seemed to go beyond what she needed to know for medical operations. She also seemed to know more about the city's geography and the locations of other survivor groups than someone who had recently arrived at the hospital should have known. The fuel crisis was becoming critical. Our generators were consuming diesel at rates that would exhaust our reserves within days. Marcus had been working on reducing power consumption by shutting down non-essential systems and consolidating our operations into smaller areas of the building. But even with these conservation measures, we were running out of time. I made the decision to conduct another supply run, this time focused on finding fuel rather than medical supplies. We needed diesel for the generators, gasoline for potential vehicle operations, and any other combustible materials that could be used for heating. The supply run would be more dangerous than our previous expedition because fuel was even more valuable than medication in the current environment. The second supply run revealed how much more dangerous the city had become. We encountered multiple groups of armed survivors who were actively fighting each other for control of resources. The violence was escalating beyond simple competition for supplies. It was becoming warfare between different factions that had emerged from the chaos of the first week. We found fuel at a construction site that had been abandoned when the eruption occurred. The site had several generators and fuel tanks that hadn't been completely emptied. But we also discovered that other groups had been using the site as a base of operations, and we had to negotiate with them for access to the fuel supplies. The negotiation was more complex than our previous encounters. The group controlling the construction site wanted medical services in exchange for fuel, specifically treatment for several members who had been injured in conflicts with other groups. I agreed to provide medical care, but I also established that any treatment would take place at the hospital where we had proper facilities and security. When we returned to the hospital with the fuel, I discovered that Maria had been conducting unauthorized radio communications. She claimed that she was trying to contact other medical facilities to coordinate care for patients who needed specialized treatment. But the frequency she was using and the timing of her communication suggested that she was providing information to outside groups about our operations. I confronted Maria about the radio communications, and her explanation was plausible, but not entirely convincing. She insisted that she was only trying to help patients who needed care that we couldn't provide at the hospital. But I noticed that she was evasive about the specific details of her communications and defensive about my questions regarding her activities. The confrontation with Maria created tension within our group. Some survivors supported her, arguing that communication with other groups was essential for long-term survival. Others were suspicious of her activities and wanted her to be more closely monitored. I decided to restrict her access to radio equipment while continuing to utilize her medical expertise. On the 14th day, we faced the most serious attack yet. A coordinated assault by 3 different groups that had apparently been planning the operation for several days. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, with one group creating a diversion at the main entrance while the others attempted to breach the building through less defended access points. The battle for the hospital lasted for several hours and resulted in casualties on both sides. We lost 3 survivors, including Mr. Chun, Dr. Chun's elderly father, who had been one of our diabetic patients. The attackers lost at least 5 people, but they also succeeded in breaching our outer defenses and reaching the main medication storage area. I was forced to make a decision that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks earlier. I authorized the use of medical supplies as weapons, specifically using concentrated cleaning chemicals and pharmaceutical compounds to create improvised defensive devices. This represented a complete abandonment of my medical ethics in favor of survival priorities. The attack was ultimately repelled, but it revealed the inadequacy of our defensive preparations. The attackers had detailed knowledge of our building layout and our security protocols, confirming that someone in our group had been providing information to outside enemies. The insider threat was no longer a suspicion. It was a confirmed reality that had to be addressed immediately. After the attack, I implemented strict security measures that restricted access to sensitive areas of the hospital and limited the information that was shared with the general population of survivors. Only the core leadership group would have access to supply inventories, defensive plans, and communication equipment. The psychological impact of the battle was devastating for our group. We had been forced to kill other human beings in order to protect our own lives, and the moral weight of that reality was overwhelming. Some survivors questioned whether we were still the good people we had been before the eruption, or if we had become something else entirely. I began to understand that survival in this new world required a different kind of moral framework than the one we had operated under in normal society. The ethical principles that had guided my decisions as a pharmacist were being replaced by harsher calculations about group survival and resource allocation. The radio communications became more frequent and more sophisticated. I was hearing chatter about large-scale operations being planned against the remaining hospitals and medical facilities in the city. Our hospital was mentioned specifically as a primary target because of our pharmaceutical resources and our strategic location. I realized that we couldn't continue to defend the hospital indefinitely. Our supplies were dwindling, our defensive capabilities were limited, and the attacks were becoming more frequent and more sophisticated. We needed to consider the possibility that our survival might depend on abandoning the hospital and finding a more defensible location. The decision to potentially evacuate the hospital was the most difficult leadership choice I had made. The hospital represented safety, medical resources, and the closest thing to normal life that we had experienced since the eruption. But it was also becoming a target that was attracting more attention than we could handle with our limited numbers and resources. I began developing contingency plans for emergency evacuation, identifying alternative locations that might provide better security and essential supplies for long-term survival. These plans had to be kept secret from most of the group, shared only with Janet and Marcus, who could help with the logistics of such a complex operation. The attacks were becoming more frequent, and I knew that we were running out of time. Each successful defense cost us people and resources that we couldn't replace. The groups targeting us were learning from each failed attack and developing more sophisticated strategies for breaching our defenses. And then I found the radio hidden in the supply closet. Someone had been using it every night at midnight to communicate with outside groups, providing them with detailed information about our operations, our defenses, and our supply levels. The betrayal was complete and undeniable. I decided to find out who had been using the radio, but what I discovered would tear our group apart and force me to confront the reality that survival had turned us all into people we never thought we could become. I positioned myself in the supply closet at 11:45 that night, hidden behind shelves of medical equipment where I could observe without being seen. The radio was exactly where I'd found it earlier that day, a small handheld device that had been carefully concealed behind boxes of surgical supplies. My heart was racing as I waited to discover which member of our group had been betraying us to the outside attackers. At exactly midnight, I heard footsteps approaching the supply closet. The door opened quietly, and Maria Santos slipped inside, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who had done this many times before. She retrieved the radio from its hiding place and began adjusting the frequency with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly which channel to use. I remained hidden as Maria began her transmission. "Phoenix General, this is Nightingale," she whispered into the radio. "Status report. Current population 17 survivors. Medication supplies at 60% of original inventory. Fuel reserves critical. Next supply run planned for day 16. Route to be determined." The clinical precision of her intelligence report made it clear that this wasn't a desperate communication with family members, but systematic espionage. The response came immediately from the other end of the radio. "Acknowledged, Nightingale. Primary assault scheduled for day 18. Need confirmation of pharmaceutical storage locations and guard rotations." Maria provided detailed information about our defensive positions, the times when our security was weakest, and the exact locations of our most valuable medical supplies. I listened in horror as Maria continued her report. She described the insulin crisis we'd been managing, the fuel consumption rates that Marcus had calculated, and even the personal medical conditions of individual survivors that I'd shared with her in confidence. Every piece of information I'd trusted her with had been transmitted to the groups that were planning to kill us. When Maria finished her transmission and left the supply closet, I remained hidden for several more minutes, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The woman who had been caring for our patients, who had saved lives during the recent attack, who had been trusted with our most sensitive medical operations, was systematically betraying us to our enemies. I spent the rest of that night wrestling with what to do about Maria's betrayal. My first instinct was to confront her immediately and demand an explanation. But I also realized that her radio communications might provide us with valuable intelligence about the groups that were targeting us. If I could find a way to monitor them without revealing that I knew about her activities. The next morning, I called a private meeting with Janet and Marcus. I explained what I discovered about Maria's nighttime communications, showing them the radio and sharing the details of the conversation I'd overheard. Their reactions were a mixture of shock, anger, and fear about what this betrayal meant for our group's survival. Janet was the first to speak after I finished my explanation. "We have to confront her immediately," she said. "Every minute we wait, she's providing them with more information they can use against us." Marcus agreed, arguing that Maria's continued presence in our group represented an unacceptable security risk that needed to be eliminated immediately. But I had a different perspective on how to handle the situation. Maria's betrayal was devastating, but it also represented an opportunity to gather intelligence about our enemies and potentially turn the situation to our advantage. If we could control the information she was transmitting, we might be able to mislead the attacking groups and gain a strategic advantage. I decided to confront Maria privately before taking any action that would reveal to the entire group that we had an informant among us. I found her in the main nursing station, where she was updating patient charts with the same professional dedication she'd shown since joining our group. The contrast between her apparent loyalty and her actual betrayal was almost impossible to reconcile. "Maria, I need to speak with you privately," I said, leading her to an empty patient room where we wouldn't be overheard. "I know about the radio communications. I know you've been providing information to the groups that are attacking us." I watched her face carefully, looking for signs of denial, surprise, or guilt. Maria's reaction was not what I'd expected. Instead of denying the accusations or expressing remorse, she looked relieved that her secret activities had been discovered. "You don't understand the situation I'm in," she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion and stress. "They have my daughter. Elena is only 8 years old, and they took her on the second day after the eruption." The revelation about Maria's daughter changed everything about how I understood her betrayal. She wasn't working with our enemies out of greed or malice, but because they were holding her child hostage to ensure her cooperation. The moral complexity of the situation was overwhelming, forcing me to consider whether I would make different choices if I were in her position. Maria explained that she had been trying to reach the hospital when Elena was taken by a group that called itself the Phoenix Collective. They had identified Maria as a medical professional and offered her a choice: provide intelligence about any medical facility she encountered, or never see her daughter again. She had been transmitting information not to help our enemies, but to save her child's life. They told me that if I stopped providing intelligence, or if they discovered that I was giving them false information, Elena would be killed. Maria continued. "Every night when I make those transmissions, I'm choosing between your lives and my daughter's life. I hate myself for what I'm doing, but I can't let them hurt her." I realized that Maria's situation represented the kind of impossible moral choice that the apocalypse was forcing on all of us. She was betraying people who trusted her in order to protect someone she loved even more. There was no clearly right answer, no ethical framework that could resolve the conflict between loyalty to our group and love for her child. The conversation with Maria lasted for over an hour as I tried to understand the full scope of her communications with the Phoenix Collective. She provided detailed information about their organization, their leadership structure, and their plans for the hospital. This intelligence was valuable, but it also revealed how sophisticated and well-organized our enemies had become. The Phoenix Collective wasn't just another group of desperate survivors competing for resources. They were a military-style organization that had been systematically taking control of medical facilities throughout the city. They had identified healthcare resources as the key to long-term survival and were eliminating any competition for access to those resources. Maria told me that the Phoenix Collective was planning a massive assault on our hospital in 3 days. They would attack with over 30 people, using information she had provided about our defenses and our supply locations. The attack would be designed not just to take our resources, but to eliminate us as a potential threat to their territorial control. I faced a decision that would define my leadership and determine the survival of everyone in our group. I could expose Maria's betrayal to the other survivors and deal with her as a traitor, or I could try to use her position as a double agent to turn the situation to our advantage. Both choices carried enormous risks and moral implications. I chose to work with Maria rather than against her. I explained that we would continue her radio communications, but that she would provide false information designed to mislead the Phoenix Collective about our defenses and our capabilities. This would be dangerous for both Maria and for Elena, but it might give us the advantage we needed to survive the coming assault. Maria agreed to the plan, but she was terrified about what would happen to her daughter if the Phoenix Collective discovered that she was providing false intelligence. I promised her that we would do everything possible to rescue Elena during the chaos of the attack, but I knew that this was a promise I might not be able to keep. The next phase of our survival strategy required convincing Janet and Marcus to accept Maria's continued presence in our group, despite her betrayal. This was an extremely difficult conversation, as both of them felt that trusting her again was impossible and dangerous. They argued that her loyalty would always be divided between our group and her daughter's safety. I explained my plan to use Maria as a double agent, providing false information to the Phoenix Collective that would give us strategic advantages during their planned assault. Janet was skeptical about the plan's feasibility, while Marcus was concerned about the security risks of allowing Maria to continue her communications with our enemies. The debate about Maria's fate revealed fundamental differences in how we approached survival ethics. Janet believed that group loyalty had to be absolute and that betrayal, regardless of the circumstances, made someone a permanent security risk. Marcus agreed that Maria's continued presence endangered everyone else in our group. My perspective was that survival required us to use every advantage available, even if that meant working with someone whose loyalty was compromised. Maria's knowledge of the Phoenix Collective and her established communication channel with them represented opportunities that we couldn't afford to waste. Her betrayal was unforgivable, but her continued cooperation might save our lives. I made the executive decision to implement the double agent plan, despite Janet and Marcus's objections. This created tension within our leadership group, but I believed that the potential benefits outweighed the risks. Maria would continue her nighttime communications, but the information she transmitted would be carefully crafted to mislead our enemies. The false intelligence operation required careful planning to be effective. We needed to provide information that was plausible enough to be believed, but inaccurate enough to give us tactical advantages. Maria would report false guard rotations, incorrect supply locations, and misleading information about our defensive capabilities. We also began preparing for the Phoenix Collective's assault by implementing defensive strategies based on the false information Maria would be transmitting. If she reported that our main medication storage was in the East Wing, we would prepare our real defenses in the West Wing where our actual supplies were located. The psychological preparation for using Maria as a double agent was as challenging as the tactical planning. I had to work with someone I no longer trusted, while she had to continue betraying people she claimed to care about. The moral ambiguity of the situation was exhausting for everyone involved. Maria's first false intelligence transmission took place 3 nights after our confrontation. She reported that our group had been reduced to 12 survivors due to recent casualties, that our fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, and that our main pharmaceutical storage had been moved to a more vulnerable location. The Phoenix Collective's response indicated that they believed the information and were adjusting their assault plans accordingly. The success of the false intelligence gave us hope that we might be able to survive the coming attack, but it also increased the danger to Elena. If the Phoenix Collective discovered that Maria was providing false information, they would likely kill her daughter immediately. The weight of that possibility made every aspect of our planning more urgent and more morally complex. During this period, I also had to manage the psychological impact of the betrayal on the rest of our survivor group. Most of them still didn't know about Maria's communications with our enemies, but they could sense the tension within our leadership team. Trust was becoming a scarce resource that was as valuable as medication or fuel. I decided to reveal Maria's situation to Dr. Chun, whose medical expertise and psychological insight I valued. Dr. Chun's reaction was more measured than Janet or Marcus had been. She understood the impossible position Maria was in, and she also recognized the strategic value of the double-agent operation. Dr. Chun helped me develop protocols for managing the false intelligence operation while maintaining operational security within our group. We established code words and communication procedures that would allow us to coordinate our deception without revealing sensitive information to anyone who might compromise the operation. The planning for our defense against the Phoenix Collective's assault required us to think like military strategists rather than medical professionals. We were designing ambushes, preparing improvised weapons, and creating kill zones within our own hospital. The transformation from healers to warriors was psychologically devastating, but strategically necessary. Marcus worked on physical modifications to the hospital that would support our defensive strategy. He created false storage areas that would appear to contain valuable supplies, while concealing our real resources in locations that the Phoenix Collective wouldn't expect. He also prepared demolition charges that could destroy critical areas of the building if we were overrun. Janet focused on medical preparations for the battle. She established triage areas, prepared surgical kits for treating combat injuries, and trained other survivors in emergency medical procedures. She also prepared medications that could be used as weapons, including concentrated sedatives that could be deployed against attackers. My role evolved into something closer to a military commander than a pharmacist. I was coordinating intelligence, operations, planning defensive strategies, and making decisions about resource allocation that would determine who lived and who died. The person I was becoming bore little resemblance to the man who had been measuring medication doses just 3 weeks earlier. The radio communications with the Phoenix Collective became more frequent as their planned assault approached. Maria was providing detailed false information about our defensive preparations, our supply levels, and our personnel capabilities. Each transmission increased the risk to her daughter while potentially saving the lives of our group members. 2 days before the planned assault, Maria received disturbing information during her radio communications. The Phoenix Collective had captured several other medical professionals and was forcing them to provide similar intelligence about other facilities. Elena wasn't the only child being held hostage to ensure cooperation from parents with valuable skills. This revelation made me realize that our situation was part of a larger pattern of systematic exploitation. The Phoenix Collective was using psychological warfare and hostage-taking to control the medical resources throughout the city. They had weaponized parental love and professional ethics to build a network of informants and collaborators. The night before the assault, I made a decision that would either save our group or destroy us completely. I authorized Maria to transmit information that would lead the Phoenix Collective directly into a trap we had prepared in the hospital's main lobby. This trap would either eliminate the threat they represented or provoke them into a final decisive battle that would determine the future of medical care in Phoenix. Maria's final intelligence transmission was the most detailed and most false information she had provided. She reported that our entire group would be evacuating the hospital through the loading dock at dawn, leaving behind a small guard force to protect our most valuable supplies. She provided specific timing information and detailed descriptions of our planned evacuation route. The reality was that we would be positioned throughout the hospital in carefully prepared defensive positions, waiting for the Phoenix Collective to enter the building through the routes Maria had suggested. We had prepared our most devastating defensive measures for the areas where we expected them to concentrate their forces. As I write this, it's the night before the battle that will determine whether we survive as a group or whether the Phoenix Collective will eliminate us and take control of our medical resources. Maria is in her room, probably unable to sleep as she thinks about her daughter and the role she's playing in tomorrow's conflict. I've been thinking about the moral compromises we've all made in the past 3 weeks. Maria betrayed us to save her daughter. I'm using her love for her child as a weapon against our enemies. Janet and Marcus are preparing to kill people who are probably just as desperate and frightened as we are. We've all become people we never thought we could be. The radio chatter has been increasing throughout the evening. I can hear communications between different groups that are coordinating for tomorrow's assault. They're not just planning to take our supplies, they're planning to eliminate us completely. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the margin for error couldn't be smaller. Tomorrow's battle will determine not just whether our group survives, but whether the idea of ethical medical care can exist in this new world. If the Phoenix Collective succeeds, medical resources will be controlled by whoever is most ruthless and most willing to use violence. If we succeed, we might be able to preserve the principle that healthcare should serve those who need it most, rather than those who are strongest. I've prepared final instructions for our survivors about what to do if I don't survive tomorrow's assault. The medication protocols, the supply inventories, the defensive plans, everything they'll need to continue operating without me. Leadership in this new world isn't about authority or recognition. It's about ensuring that essential knowledge and resources continue to serve the people who need them most. The assault is planned for dawn, which means we have less than 6 hours to finalize our preparations. Maria will make her final radio communication at midnight, confirming the false information about our evacuation plans. After that, we'll either triumph over the forces that are trying to destroy us, or we'll discover that survival requires even greater moral compromises than we've already made. But I had one advantage they didn't know about. While Maria had been telling them that our pharmaceutical storage was in the East Wing, our real supplies were hidden throughout the building in locations they would never expect. And I knew exactly what medications those attacking soldiers would need if they wanted to survive what we had prepared for them. The assault came at dawn exactly as Maria had transmitted to the Phoenix Collective. I watched from my position in the West Wing as 32 armed attackers surrounded the hospital, moving with military precision toward the locations where they expected to find our main defenses and supply storage areas. They had believed every piece of false intelligence Maria had provided, and they were walking directly into the trap we had spent days preparing. The Phoenix Collective split into 3 groups as they approached the building. The largest group moved toward the East Wing, where Maria had told them our pharmaceutical supplies were stored. A second group positioned themselves around the loading dock, where they expected to intercept our fictional evacuation. The third group prepared to breach the main lobby where Maria had reported we would have minimal defensive presence. What they didn't know was that we had positioned our strongest defenses exactly where they expected to find our weaknesses. The East Wing had been rigged with improvised explosive devices that Marcus had created using cleaning chemicals and medical oxygen tanks. The loading dock was defended by Janet and 4 other survivors armed with medical equipment that had been modified into weapons. The main lobby was where I waited with our most devastating surprise. The first explosion came from the East Wing as the Phoenix Collective's largest assault team triggered the chemical bombs Marcus had prepared. The building shook with the force of the detonation, and I could hear screams from the attackers who had been caught in the blast. Our false intelligence had worked perfectly, concentrating their forces in the area where we could inflict maximum casualties. The second phase of the attack began immediately as the remaining Phoenix Collective members realized they had been deceived. Instead of proceeding with their original plan, they began a chaotic assault on multiple entry points simultaneously. This desperation worked to our advantage because it prevented them from coordinating their superior numbers effectively. The battle for the hospital lasted for 4 hours and was unlike anything I could have imagined 3 weeks earlier. I found myself using concentrated pharmaceuticals as weapons, deploying sedative gases to incapacitate attackers, and making tactical decisions that determined who lived and who died. The pharmacist who had carefully measured medication doses had become a military commander, directing life-and-death combat operations. During the height of the battle, I made a decision that saved our group, but violated every ethical principle I had held as a medical professional. When a group of Phoenix Collective attackers had Janet and 2 other survivors trapped in the main pharmacy, I released a concentrated aerosol of fentanyl that incapacitated the attackers, but also endangered our own people. It was effective military tactics and medical malpractice simultaneously. The turning point came when we captured James Morrison, the Phoenix Collective's second-in-command, who had been critically wounded during the assault on the East Wing. Morrison was bleeding internally and would die without immediate surgical intervention. I faced a choice between providing medical treatment to someone who had been trying to kill us or letting him die and losing valuable intelligence about their organization. I chose to save Morrison's life, despite the objections of other survivors who wanted him to face the consequences of his actions. This decision wasn't based on medical ethics or humanitarian principles, but on the strategic calculation that his information about the Phoenix Collective's operations and hostage locations would be more valuable than his death would be satisfying. Morrison's medical treatment took place under guard in our main surgical suite. As I worked to repair his internal injuries, he provided information about the Phoenix Collective structure, their territorial control throughout Phoenix, and most importantly, the location where they were holding Elena and other hostages. This intelligence would prove crucial for the next phase of our survival strategy. The interrogation revealed that the Phoenix Collective was more sophisticated and more dangerous than we had understood. They controlled most of the medical facilities in Phoenix and had established a network of forced labor using medical professionals whose families were being held hostage. Elena was being kept at a fortified compound in Scottsdale, along with dozens of other children whose parents were providing services to the organization. Morrison also told us about a government evacuation facility in Tucson that was accepting survivors, but would close permanently in 10 days. The facility had limited capacity and was operating on a first-come, first-served basis. Hundreds of survivor groups throughout Arizona were traveling toward Tucson, competing for access to what might be the last official rescue operation. This information forced me to confront an impossible choice. We could remain at the hospital and continue defending our medical resources against increasingly sophisticated attacks, or we could abandon our supplies and attempt to reach the evacuation facility before it closed. Both options carried enormous risks and uncertain outcomes. The decision was complicated by our responsibility to Maria and her daughter. If we left Phoenix without attempting to rescue Elena, we would be abandoning a child to an organization that had proven they were willing to kill hostages to maintain control. But attempting a rescue operation would delay our departure and reduce our chances of reaching the evacuation facility in time. I called a meeting with our surviving group members to discuss the evacuation option. We had lost 6 people during the battle with the Phoenix Collective, leaving us with 11 survivors plus Morrison, who was technically our prisoner. Our medical supplies had been depleted by the battle, our fuel reserves were critically low, and our defensive positions had been compromised by the fighting. The group was divided about whether to attempt the journey to Tucson. Some survivors argued that we should remain at the hospital, where we had medical facilities and established defenses. Others believed that the Phoenix Collective would return with larger forces, and that our only chance for long-term survival was to reach the government evacuation facility. Janet was strongly in favor of attempting the evacuation. She pointed out that our medical supplies would eventually be exhausted, regardless of how successfully we defended the hospital. The evacuation facility represented the possibility of reaching a location with better resources and government protection. The risk of the journey was justified by the certainty that staying would eventually result in our destruction. Marcus was more cautious about the evacuation plan. He argued that we didn't know what conditions we would face at the Tucson facility, or whether it would actually provide the safety and resources we hoped for. The journey would expose us to attacks from other survivor groups, mechanical failures, and weather conditions that could be just as deadly as the threats we faced at the hospital. Maria's position was predictable but complicated the decision-making process. She was desperate to attempt the rescue of her daughter, regardless of the risks to the rest of the group. Her maternal instincts were completely understandable, but they were in conflict with the strategic interests of our survival group. I had to balance her personal needs against the welfare of everyone else. Dr. Chun provided a perspective that helped clarify the decision. She had been monitoring radio communications and had learned that the Phoenix Collective was planning to return to the hospital with reinforcements within 48 hours. They had identified us as a significant threat to their territorial control and were committed to eliminating us completely. We couldn't win a second battle against a larger, better prepared enemy force. I made the decision to attempt the evacuation to Tucson, but with conditions that addressed our various obligations and strategic needs. We would attempt to rescue Elena during our departure from Phoenix, but we wouldn't delay our journey or compromise our chances of reaching the evacuation facility. If the rescue attempt failed, we would continue to Tucson without her. The evacuation plan required us to coordinate multiple complex operations simultaneously. We needed to identify and prepare vehicles for the journey, select which medical supplies were portable and essential, and plan the route to Tucson that would minimize our exposure to hostile groups. We also needed to develop the rescue operation for Elena that would be integrated into our departure from Phoenix. Morrison provided detailed intelligence about the Phoenix Collective's compound in Scottsdale, where Elena and other hostages were being held. The facility was heavily defended and constantly guarded, but it also had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a small, well-planned operation. The key was timing the rescue attempt to coincide with our departure from Phoenix. The vehicle preparation was challenging because most cars in Phoenix had been damaged by the extreme cold and ash precipitation. Marcus identified 3 vehicles that could potentially make the journey to Tucson: a hospital ambulance with 4-wheel drive capability, a maintenance truck with good heating systems, and a delivery van that could carry our essential supplies. The medical supply selection process was heartbreaking because it required abandoning resources that had taken weeks to accumulate and organize. I had to choose which medications were absolutely essential for the journey and which could be left behind. Every item we abandoned represented someone who might die because we didn't have the right treatment available. I decided to prioritize medications that treated the most common survival-related conditions: antibiotics for infections, pain medications for injuries, insulin for diabetics, and cardiac medications for stress-related heart problems. I also selected psychiatric medications because I knew that the psychological trauma of evacuation and rescue operations would create mental health crises that could be as dangerous as physical injuries. The route planning required balancing speed against safety. The most direct route to Tucson would take us through areas that were controlled by hostile survivor groups, but it would also minimize our travel time and fuel consumption. Alternative routes were safer, but would take longer and might cause us to arrive at the evacuation facility after it had closed. Dr. Chun had been monitoring radio communications from other survivor groups that were also traveling toward Tucson. The reports were disturbing because they indicated that the journey was extremely dangerous and that many groups were not surviving the trip. Mechanical failures, attacks by hostile groups, and exposure to the harsh weather conditions were eliminating significant numbers of people who attempted the evacuation. The rescue operation for Elena required careful coordination with our departure. Timing. We would approach the Phoenix Collective compound at dawn, conduct a rapid extraction operation, and then proceed immediately toward Tucson without returning to the hospital. This meant that we had to prepare for the journey and the rescue simultaneously. Maria's role in the rescue operation was both essential and dangerous. She had detailed knowledge of the compound's layout and the routines of the guards, but her emotional investment in her daughter's safety could compromise her judgment during the operation. I assigned Janet to work closely with Maria to ensure that maternal instincts didn't override tactical discipline. The night before our departure, I conducted final preparations that included destroying sensitive medical equipment and supplies that we couldn't transport. This was necessary to prevent the Phoenix Collective from capturing resources that could be used against other survivor groups. But it was also emotionally devastating to destroy things that had saved lives. Morrison presented an unexpected complication for our evacuation plans. He was still recovering from his surgical treatment and couldn't travel safely, but we also couldn't leave him behind where he might provide intelligence to the Phoenix Collective about our destination and capabilities. I made the decision to take him with us as a prisoner, despite the additional resources this would require. The psychological preparation for leaving the hospital was as challenging as the logistical planning. The building had been our home, our fortress, and our identity for 3 weeks. Abandoning it felt like surrendering a part of ourselves to an uncertain future. But I knew that survival sometimes required leaving behind everything familiar in favor of unknown possibilities. The final radio communication from the evacuation facility in Tucson was both encouraging and alarming. They confirmed that they were still accepting survivors, but they also warned that capacity was nearly exhausted and that the facility would close to new arrivals within days. Hundreds of groups were traveling toward Tucson, and many would be turned away when they arrived. As we prepared to leave the hospital, I reflected on how much we had changed during our 3 weeks of survival. We had evolved from medical professionals and patients into a military-style unit capable of conducting combat operations and rescue missions. The transformation had been necessary for survival, but it had also cost us parts of our humanity that might never be recovered. The vehicles were loaded with our essential supplies, our weapons, and our portable medical equipment. Each person carried a survival pack with personal items and backup medications. Morrison was secured in the ambulance where he could receive continued medical care while remaining under guard. Maria was equipped with weapons and communication equipment for the rescue operation. The route to the Phoenix Collective compound would take us through areas of Phoenix that had been transformed by 3 weeks of volcanic winter. The city we had known was gone, replaced by a frozen wasteland populated by desperate people who would kill for the resources we were carrying. Every mile of the journey would be dangerous, but the alternative was certain death at the hospital. As we prepared to depart, I realized that this journey would either lead us to safety and the possibility of rebuilding our lives, or it would result in our destruction in the frozen ruins of Phoenix. The margin for error was minimal, and the stakes were absolute. We were about to discover whether the survival skills we had developed were sufficient for the challenges that lay ahead. The rescue operation would be our first test. If we could successfully extract Elena from the Phoenix Collective compound, it would demonstrate that we had become capable of offensive operations as well as defensive ones. If we failed, we would lose not only a child but also the trust and cooperation that held our group together. I could see the fence around the evacuation facility, the soldiers manning the perimeter, and the crowds of desperate people who were being turned away because there was no more room. And I realized we'd have to fight our way in, using every skill and every resource we had accumulated during our weeks of survival in the frozen ruins of Phoenix. The rescue operation at the Phoenix Collective compound began at dawn on day 26. We approached the Scottsdale facility in our 3 vehicles, moving through the frozen streets of what had once been one of Arizona's most affluent communities. The mansions and golf courses were now buried under ash and snow, transformed into a landscape that looked more like a war zone than a suburban paradise. The compound itself was a converted resort that the Phoenix Collective had fortified with razor wire, concrete barriers, and guard towers. Morrison had provided detailed intelligence about the facility's layout, telling us that Elena and the other hostages were being held in the main conference center building. He estimated that there were 15 guards on duty at any given time, with additional security forces available if an alarm was raised. Maria was positioned in the lead vehicle with Janet and Marcus, while I remained in the ambulance with Morrison and 3 other survivors. The plan was for Maria's team to create a diversion at the main gate while my team entered through a service entrance that Morrison had identified as the facility's weakest point. The timing had to be perfect because we would have only minutes to extract Elena before the Phoenix Collective could organize a coordinated response. The diversion began exactly as planned. Maria's team approached the main gate and demanded medical treatment for a supposedly critical patient in their vehicle. While the guards were focused on this distraction, my team moved through the service entrance and began searching for the hostage-holding area. Morrison's intelligence proved accurate as we navigated through corridors that matched his descriptions perfectly. We found Elena in a locked conference room along with 12 other children whose ages ranged from 6 to 14. The children were frightened and malnourished, but they were alive and uninjured. Elena recognized me from the hospital and called out when she saw me, which helped calm the other children and made the extraction process more manageable. The challenge was evacuating 13 children through a hostile facility while maintaining operational security. We couldn't move them all at once without attracting attention, but we also couldn't afford to make multiple trips that would increase our exposure to discovery. I made the decision to move all the children together, using medical equipment to sedate the youngest ones who might cry out during the evacuation. The extraction was complicated when we encountered 2 guards who weren't supposed to be in that area of the facility. These guards weren't part of the main distraction at the gate, and their presence forced us into a confrontation that could have compromised the entire operation. Janet used a concentrated sedative to incapacitate both guards, but they're unconscious. Bodies would eventually be discovered and raise alarms. We successfully evacuated all 13 children from the facility and loaded them into our vehicles before the Phoenix Collective realized what had happened. But the rescue operation had taken longer than planned, and we could hear alarm sirens beginning to sound as we departed the compound. The Phoenix Collective would organize pursuit operations within minutes, and we needed to be far from Scottsdale before they could mobilize their forces. The journey from Phoenix to Tucson began under the worst possible circumstances. We were traveling with 13 traumatized children. We were being pursued by a hostile organization with superior numbers and weapons, and we were operating on minimal fuel reserves. The vehicles were overcrowded and moving slowly because of the poor road conditions and the extra weight we were carrying. Maria's reunion with Elena was emotionally overwhelming, but it also created operational challenges. Elena was suffering from malnutrition and psychological trauma that required immediate medical attention. She was also terrified of separation from her mother, which made it difficult for Maria to focus on her responsibilities as part of our survival group. The other children presented similar challenges. Most of them had been separated from their families for weeks and had no idea whether their parents were still alive. Some had witnessed violence and trauma that had left them in states of shock that required careful psychological management. We were now responsible for 13 additional lives that were completely dependent on our resources and protection. The first major obstacle came 30 miles south of Phoenix, when we encountered a roadblock that had been established by another survivor group. The roadblock consisted of abandoned vehicles that had been positioned to force travelers into a narrow corridor where they could be easily controlled. Armed guards were positioned behind the barriers, and they were demanding payment for passage through their territory. The negotiation at the roadblock was tense because we couldn't afford to give up resources that we needed for the journey, but we also couldn't fight our way through without endangering the children. I decided to offer medical services in exchange for passage, explaining that we had a doctor and medical supplies that could treat injuries and illnesses within their group. The leader of the roadblock group was a former police officer named David Martinez, who had been maintaining order in this section of the highway since the eruption. Martinez was reasonable and professional, but he was also clearly desperate for medical assistance. Several members of his group were suffering from frostbite, infections, and other conditions that required immediate treatment. I agreed to provide medical care for his most seriously ill group members in exchange for safe passage and information about road conditions between our location and Tucson. This negotiation consumed valuable time, but it also gave us intelligence about other roadblocks and hostile groups that we would encounter during the remainder of our journey. The medical treatment I provided at the roadblock demonstrated how much my role had evolved since the eruption. I was treating conditions that would have required hospitalization in the normal world using portable equipment and limited supplies. Frostbite amputations, infection management, and trauma surgery were being performed in the back of vehicles under conditions that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks earlier. Martinez provided disturbing information about the evacuation facility in Tucson. According to radio communications he had monitored, the facility was being overwhelmed by arriving survivors and was turning away large numbers of people. The government personnel operating the facility were prioritizing people with essential skills, particularly medical professionals, but they were also implementing strict capacity limits that meant many groups would be refused entry. More concerning was Martinez's report about violent conflicts at the evacuation facility. Desperate groups were fighting each other for access to the facility, and some were attempting to take it by force. The government forces were responding with lethal force to maintain order, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly as more survivor groups arrived. After completing the medical treatments and receiving our passage clearance, we continued south toward Tucson. The highway was littered with abandoned vehicles, frozen bodies, and evidence of conflicts between different survivor groups. The journey that should have taken 3 hours in normal conditions was requiring an entire day because of road obstacles and the need to avoid hostile territories. The second major challenge came when our lead vehicle suffered a mechanical failure that left us stranded in an exposed area where we were vulnerable to attack. The extreme cold had caused a fuel line to freeze, and Marcus needed time to repair the problem using improvised tools and materials. We were forced to establish defensive positions around the vehicles while he worked on the repairs. During the vehicle repair, we were approached by another group of survivors who were also traveling toward Tucson. This group included a pregnant woman who was in active labor, and they were requesting medical assistance for the delivery. The situation forced me to choose between helping people who needed medical care and maintaining our operational security. I decided to assist with the childbirth, both because it was consistent with my medical ethics and because it might create an alliance with another group that could provide mutual protection during the remainder of the journey. The delivery took place in the back of their vehicle while Marcus continued working on our mechanical repairs. The baby was born healthy despite the challenging conditions, but the birth also revealed how much the apocalypse had changed the fundamental experiences of human life. This child was being born into a world without hospitals, without reliable food supplies, and without the social structures that had supported human civilization for centuries. The birth was simultaneously a symbol of hope and a reminder of how uncertain the future had become. The group with the newborn decided to join our convoy for the remainder of the journey to Tucson. This increased our numbers to 24 people, including the 13 rescued children, but it also strained our resources and complicated our decision-making processes. We were becoming a larger community rather than a small survival group, which created both advantages and disadvantages. The mechanical repairs were completed successfully, but they had consumed several hours that brought us closer to the closure of the evacuation facility. We were now racing against time as well as competing with other groups for access to what might be our last chance for government assistance. The pressure was affecting everyone's behavior and decision-making capabilities. The final approach to Tucson revealed the true scale of the humanitarian crisis. The highway was crowded with hundreds of vehicles carrying thousands of survivors who were all attempting to reach the evacuation facility. Many of these vehicles had broken down or run out of fuel, leaving families stranded in the desert with no way to complete their journey. The evacuation facility itself was surrounded by a massive encampment of people who had arrived too late to gain entry. The government forces had established a perimeter around the facility and were turning away new arrivals, but they were also providing limited humanitarian assistance to prevent the surrounding crowds from becoming completely desperate. The scene at the facility was chaotic and heartbreaking. Families were being separated as government personnel selected individuals with essential skills for evacuation while leaving others behind. Children were crying for parents who had been taken into the facility, and parents were desperately trying to convince the guards to accept their families as units. I approached the facility's medical screening station and identified myself as a clinical pharmacist with emergency medicine experience. The screening officer was interested in my qualifications, but he explained that medical professionals were being prioritized for evacuation only if they could demonstrate specialized skills that weren't already available within the facility. The demonstration of my pharmaceutical expertise involved treating several patients who were suffering from medication-related problems that the facility's medical staff hadn't been able to resolve. I provided solutions for drug interactions, dosing calculations, and medication storage problems that convinced the screening officers that my skills were valuable enough to warrant evacuation. The selection process for our group was complicated by the fact that we were traveling with 13 children who weren't related to any of our adult members. The government personnel were reluctant to accept responsibility for children without clear family connections, but they also couldn't abandon them to die in the desert. The bureaucratic complications were consuming time that we didn't have. Maria's status as Elena's mother was clearly established, but the other 12 children presented legal and logistical challenges that the evacuation facility wasn't equipped to handle. I had to negotiate with multiple government officials to establish temporary guardianship arrangements that would allow all the children to be evacuated as part of our group. The negotiation process revealed that the evacuation facility wasn't actually a rescue operation in the traditional sense. It was a processing and sorting center that was designed to identify people with skills needed for rebuilding efforts in southern regions that hadn't been affected by the volcanic winter. People without essential capabilities were being transported to refugee camps rather than safe havens. This information forced me to reconsider whether evacuation through the government facility was actually in our group's best interests. The refugee camps were reported to have inadequate medical facilities, limited food supplies, and poor security arrangements. We might be trading our current challenges for different, but equally serious problems. Janet and Marcus were strongly in favor of accepting evacuation despite the uncertainties about our final destination. They argued that any government facility would be safer and better resourced than trying to survive independently in the frozen wasteland that Arizona had become. The risk of the unknown was preferable to the certainty of eventual death if we remained in the affected areas. Dr. Chun had been monitoring radio communications from other evacuation facilities and had learned disturbing information about their actual conditions. Many of the refugee camps were overcrowded, undersupplied, and experiencing high mortality rates due to disease outbreaks and inadequate medical care. The government's capacity to provide meaningful assistance was much more limited than their public announcements suggested. I made the decision to accept evacuation for our group while also preparing contingency plans for independent survival if the government facilities proved inadequate. This meant concealing some of our medical supplies and maintaining communication capabilities that would allow us to leave the facility if necessary. The final processing for evacuation took place over several hours as government personnel conducted medical examinations, background checks, and skills assessments for each member of our group. The children required special documentation procedures that involved creating temporary identity records since many of them had been separated from their families for weeks. During the processing, I learned that I would be assigned to establish and manage medical facilities at a refugee camp in southern Arizona. This assignment would utilize my pharmaceutical expertise while also providing me with authority over medical resources and personnel. The position carried significant responsibilities, but also offered opportunities to improve conditions for thousands of displaced people. The evacuation transport was a military convoy that would carry our group and approximately 200 other survivors to various destinations throughout the unaffected regions. The journey would take several days and would involve multiple stops at different facilities depending on each person's assigned destination and skill classification. As we prepared to board the evacuation vehicles, I reflected on the transformation our group had undergone during the past 6 weeks. We had evolved from medical professionals and hospital patients into a military-style survival unit capable of conducting rescue operations and fighting for our lives. The changes were necessary for survival, but they had also cost us parts of our humanity that might never be recovered. The departure from the evacuation facility marked the end of our time as an independent survival group and the beginning of our integration into the larger governmental response to the volcanic winter crisis. We were leaving behind the autonomy and self-determination that had defined our survival efforts in favor of the security and resources that organized relief efforts could provide. 6 months later, I'm writing this from the medical center I established at the refugee camp in southern Arizona. We're caring for over 3,000 displaced people, including many of the children we rescued from the Phoenix Collective compound. Elena has recovered from her ordeal and is attending the makeshift school we've established within the camp. The medical center has become a training facility where we're teaching basic healthcare skills to refugees who will eventually return to rebuild the affected regions. The knowledge and experience we gained during our survival in Phoenix has proven invaluable for preparing others to face similar challenges in their own communities. Maria has become my primary assistant in managing the medical facility, and her experience as a double agent has helped us identify and prevent security threats within the refugee population. The moral complexities of her situation during the crisis have given her insights into human behavior under extreme stress that make her particularly effective at managing difficult personnel situations. The Phoenix Collective was eventually destroyed by other survivor groups that banded together to eliminate their threat to medical resources throughout the region. The children we rescued have been reunited with surviving family members or placed with adoptive families within our refugee community. The compound in Scottsdale is now being used as a training facility for future emergency response operations. The lessons we learned about survival leadership and moral compromise have become part of the curriculum for emergency preparedness programs throughout the region. The pharmaceutical and medical protocols we developed are being implemented at other refugee facilities and survivor communities. The knowledge gained through our suffering is helping others avoid similar tragedies. Dr. Chun has established a communication network that connects medical facilities throughout the survivor communities, sharing information about treatment protocols, resource availability, and security threats. Janet has become a specialist in trauma surgery under extreme conditions, and Marcus has developed infrastructure solutions that are being implemented at facilities throughout the affected region. The newborn baby whose delivery I assisted during our journey to Tucson is now 6 months old and thriving in our refugee camp. His birth during the darkest period of our crisis has become a symbol of hope and continuity for our entire community. He represents the possibility that human civilization can survive and rebuild even after catastrophic disruption. The radio network that connects our facility with other survivor communities carries regular reports about reconstruction efforts in the affected regions. Phoenix is slowly being rebuilt as a smaller, more sustainable city designed to withstand future climate disruptions. The lessons learned during the crisis are being incorporated into urban planning and emergency preparedness systems. The government evacuation facilities have evolved into permanent resettlement communities that are designed to support long-term recovery efforts. The refugee camps are becoming towns and cities that will eventually be integrated into the larger economic and social structures of the unaffected regions. We're not just surviving, we're rebuilding human civilization in forms that are more resilient and more prepared for future crises. If you're out there, if you're listening, remember this: we're stronger together than we ever could be alone. Knowledge, especially practical knowledge about healthcare, infrastructure, and community organization, is the most valuable currency in any crisis. Compassion and cooperation are not weaknesses in survival situations. They are the foundations upon which sustainable communities are built. The skills that saved our lives during the Ice Age apocalypse are the same skills that will help humanity survive whatever challenges we face in the future. Medical expertise, technical knowledge, and most importantly, the ability to work together toward common goals. These are the tools that will determine whether our species thrives or merely survives. This is Dante Rivera, still fighting the good fight from the medical center at Refugee Camp 7 in southern Arizona. We survived the first 6 weeks of the Ice Age apocalypse, and we're using everything we learned to help others do the same. Stay strong, stay human, and never give up hope. That tomorrow can be better than today.